I'm Steve Spencer. Been retired from the university for some years, 25 years. And in the meantime, I've been associated with the pastoral mission, quite a few of those, probably at least 20, I would suspect. So this goes back quite a while. Matter of fact, I started in the Extension Service in 1957 as a county agent, and then I came up to the university for graduate work, and then came on the staff as a dairy specialist in 1961. My first experience with this Ag Progress Days was back in the days of when it was Grassland Field Days. Now this was in 1962 at the Milton Hershey Farms. And we were assigned, a colleague of mine, were assigned an area up in the fields whereby we assumed that they would bring a tractor along with people on a hay wagon so we could discuss the crops that were there. Well, we stood there for all morning long, and after lunch we decided, well, this isn't going anywhere. And so my colleague says, let's go to the fair. So that was a kind of an interesting experience on that first Grassland Field Day. Then, of course, in 1965, there was a Forage Days also in Hershey, but it was kind of renamed as the Forage Days because they were emphasizing a forage as opposed to Grassland Field Days, which the first one, I think was associated with the National Grassland Council. In 1966, it was over here in Mifflin County at the John Rogers Farm. Now, this was a fairly big farm and able to accommodate quite a few people, and so that worked out pretty well. So in 67, it went to Somerset County. Well, in Somerset County, Somerset was a potato county, so they emphasized potato production and so forth in that field day. In 68, back to Hershey again, where they held the National Plowing Contest. Now, from time to time, there were plowing contests held at the field days, but on this particular year, in 1968, it was a national plowing contest. So that was quite a big deal, because people from all over the country were entered in a competition of plowing. Then in 1969 comes a big change. It changed to the Ag Progress Days. Well, technically Agricultural Progress Days, but then shortened to Ag Progress Days. And that was in 1969 in Towanda, Pennsylvania, Bradford County. And that was a big operation. And so Jake Guffey, the county agent, was very instrumental in getting it all organized and so forth, which was a big deal, and people didn't believe that many people would show. In 1970, then it went to Crawford County, which was in the western part of the state. So in 1971, we came to the Rock Springs Farm at Penn State. So that was very interesting. The committee that was in charge of Ag Progress Days worked very hard because there was just lots of things to do. There was no place to unload the equipment that was bringing. So we had this equipment that was there, and this is still there at Penn State is the loading dock. As you see there, and still there, it's across the road from the actual Ag Progress Days is now. At first, there weren't any electrical hookups, and they just had exhibits. But then it was necessary to provide electricity to the exhibitors. And in comes a new dean. Now, Dr. Beatty came from Ohio State. Now, in Ohio State, they had, a lady had willed them her farm. And Dr. Beatty, coming from Ohio State, thought this was a great idea just to have it in one place at Penn State. Well, there were objections to this because they weren't moving around the state. This is becoming bigger and bigger all the time. and electrical connections at the power stations. And had a truckload of wire to stretch out into these farms. Well, this went on for several years. Went to Somerset County, then back to Hershey again, and went to Bloomsburg and to Mercer County, and so forth. Well, in the meantime, Dr. Beatty had established a committee to discuss the location of Ag Progress Days, and I happened to be the chairman. The objective of this committee was to establish a permanent residence at Penn State with Ag Progress Days. And then the group that was in charge of Ag Progress Days finally said, well, we'll go every other year. 1 year at Penn State, and we'll go out to outlying areas and so forth. So, okay, I go back to the dean and I told him what the wishes were of the committee. And of course, that wasn't good enough. And he said, well, you go back and tell him. I said, Dean, I don't have the votes. The votes aren't there. He said, where the hell did you learn your politics? I said, well, it only makes sense. I'm not taking a vote until I know what the outcome is. And so that's why we went on for another year or so forth. And finally, I said to the people in charge of Ag Progress Days, I said, what farm haven't we spoiled so far? Because the one at Mercer County was a big deal. It really was a good show, but it rained and it was horrible. So anyway, I said, okay, to these people that were in charge, I said, what farm are we going to spoil now? Well, that kind of turned the camera. So I went to the dean and I said, Dean Beatty, we have a decision. It will be at Penn State on a permanent basis. And that was in 1976. I went back to Penn State and it's been there ever since. And people have traveled from all over the state and other states to this affair because it has certainly become very popular. And I can remember to be almost all of them. It's been a great show, and been my pleasure to have been a part of it.